probably one of the best examples of the ways that we can really learn a lot about American history by integrating these kinds of stories is from the whole phenomenon of romantic friendship, both male and female romantic friendship, and Boston marriage, which was, was an accepted relationship between two women who lived in a marriage-like relationship in the 19th century. And so, learning about the importance of male friendship. We were talking today in John's class about Abraham Lincoln. The whole issue. Abraham Lincoln slept in bed with Joshua Speed for many years, wrote intimate letters to him, shared his heart. Was able to communicate with him better than he was with women. One of his friends said he loved him more than he loved anyone in the world, even after Lincoln was married to Mary Todd Lincoln. So the popular take on that is, was Abraham Lincoln gay? And so the really important thing is to say that's the wrong question. Why was this a normal way for men to interact with each other in the 19th century? Why was it that friendship meant something, might look like something very different than what we would think of as male friendship today? This is especially important in the case of women who were openly physically affectionate, expressed their love for one another, and I think, again, just raising the idea that these things did not mean someone was a lesbian, was homosexual, was gay, is a really important way to understand that sexuality, intimacy, friendship, all of those things have a history. My favorite example is a series of letters between two young women who became friends in school and had this very intimate relationship and one of them married a man. Her friend wrote to her friend's fiance, "Until you came along, I believed that Helena loved me almost as girls love their lovers. I know I loved her so. Don't you wonder that I can stand the sight of you." And all of that part, I think, it's my favorite example, is really important because it's both the intimacy and the fact that actually this did feel like a disruption of their friendship, that her friend was getting married, but also that she had no shame in saying to him, "Don't you wonder I can stand the sight of you, because I loved her just the way you love her." And so the acceptability of that is, I think, is something that's really important. And then to understand the ways that romantic friendship, originally the assumption was women would still have to get married, there were no really other options, but once women could enter into professions and could support themselves and could choose not to marry a man but to live with their romantic friends in this form that comes to be known as Boston marriage, then we see the way that this functioned in the settlement house community, in the labor movement, in the women's movement, how much in women's education, in women's colleges in particular, how much these Boston marriages, these friendships, these lifelong marriage-like relationships between women were the foundation of so much social change that took place in American society that simply couldn't have taken place without that. So it really opens up this idea of how do you think about friendship and intimacy before the discovery of the concept of homosexuality. And it also really undermines this notion of progress, like, oh, we're just getting better and better and better over time. Well, in the 19th century, people had a lot more leeway to have intimate relationships with someone of the same sex than in later periods of history. So I think that's a part of it too. I'm just going to go really quickly through my other examples and not in so much detail, but there's a lot of literature that talks about the frontier and really helps us to reconceptualize the notion of the frontier as sort of the most, masculine, the American spirit, all of that kind of notion. So relationships between cowboys. Brokeback Mountain, of course, kind of made this a much more public area. Much more in the public eye. But cowboys, miners, lumberjacks, the Chinese men in what were called bachelor societies, because of course Chinese women were mostly not allowed to immigrate. These were all predominantly male environments in which men formed intimate friendships, sexual relationships, and kind of pseudo marriages between in the mining and lumberjack communities between the younger men and older men, where the younger men took care of the domestic tasks and were engaged. They had been intimate, loving relationships, or sometimes they had not such intimate, loving, but sexual relationships. And obviously, cowboys and miners and lumberjacks were not, effeminate men. So this was, a very different kind of context than what we might think of in terms of the frontier. It really raises questions about the frontier spirit. Why did all these men want to go off and be in, male, sex-segregated societies? It's the same question that's been asked about pirates and sailors. Was there actually a sort of intimate and sexual reason for choosing to live in a society like this? Another topic that I think is really important is in terms of the growth of cities. This is a painting from 1936 called The Fleet's Inn, which I use in my class to really illustrate the fact that as cities grew and as people were moving from rural or small town environments to urban environments outside their families, outside their communities, this is where we see the rise of dating, of young people, young heterosocial worlds where young working class people would go off to amusement parks or movie theaters or whatever and mingle with people they didn't already know, so it wasn't a controlled kind of environment. So we have all these new phenomena of dating, of engaging in sexual, petting and other sort of pre-intercourse sexual acts with people that they weren't going to marry. I mean, it's basically a whole new world, and part of that world was also a world of same-sex interactions. And the reason I like this is, so obviously the Fleet is in New York, and you can see these sailors who are meeting all these women who are clearly perceived to be prostitutes, but there in the left-hand corner is a man who is also clearly identifiable in this context as what's known as a fairy. So he has all the markings, the blonde hair, the red necktie, all of these signals that people understood at this time meant an interest in same-sex sexual acts. And the point of this painting is that for the sailors, it mostly didn't really matter whether they were going to have sex with a prostitute or whether they were going to have sex with a fairy. And in this whole period of urban growth and development, the idea of heterosexuality, male heterosexuality, did not mean that you never had sex with another man. It meant that you played a particular role in sexual encounters, but the idea that to be heterosexual meant that you never had sex with someone of the same sex is a later development. It's a more recent kind of development. So the ways that, we talk about the growth of cities and industrialization and immigration and the way it changed all of these kinds of things, but we don't really think about the fact that the very practice of dating has a history that comes from these kinds of communities in the growing cities. And so again, it kind of undermines this notion of progress and throws open questions about how social practices develop and what the relationship is to economic change and other kinds of change. The Harlem Renaissance is a perfect example. In the 1930s, the kind of flowering of artistic and cultural development in Harlem, and the role that lesbian and gay and bisexual blues singers and artists and writers played in this whole kind of flowering. So between Greenwich Village and the Harlem Renaissance, we see a kind of connection between artistic bohemian communities and sexual explorations. And the fact that in Harlem there were these gigantic drag balls in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and white people, straight people, would flock to these balls just to watch what was going on. One of the high school teachers in our book talks about using them to discuss why straight people would go to these drag balls, why white people were into slumming in Harlem, and really illustrating the fact that that periods of artistic exploration also lead to different kinds of sexual exploration. I'm going to go really fast now because I don't want to keep you all too long, but World War II obviously plays a really important part in the whole history of sexuality. And here we have, this is an illustration from some gay soldiers in the war who were, even though there was this screening for homosexuality really for the first time, where people, men being inducted into service, were asked all these questions about their sexuality because the psychologists who were playing a role for the first time wanted to eliminate them. But of course, if you wanted to get in, you knew how to answer the questions, and if they wanted you enough, which they did increasingly as the war went on, they weren't going to get rid of you. So on the right we have drag balls, which drag performances, soldiers and drag shows. That's what I'm really trying to say, is performances that men, soldiers in drag played in, both white and black, segregated of course. And you know, one of the graduate students in theater at Ohio State, I'm still going back to that, at the University of California at Santa Barbara, did her whole dissertation on these soldier drag shows, and interviewed a man who was a gay man who was central in that. So it was one of the ways that gay men really found a place for them in the military. But the main thing about the Second World War is that it's a perfect example of how there were both repressive forces in motion. You know, they would post, these are the gay bars you should not go to, and you can imagine that was a great piece of information. And likewise, you know, some men who went to screening and were asked all these questions about their sexuality kind of realized, hey, I do have those feelings. So, and the geographic mobility and all of that. So there are lots of things. The Lavender Scare after the war, this is one of, I think, the major places that it's really easy to integrate into mainstream history, because, you know, we all know about the Red Scare, we know about the attack on communists, but in fact, the attack on homosexual employees in government was longer lasting and more pervasive even than the Red Scare. So chapters in the book talk about, wonderful chapter about J. Edgar Hoover and Clyde Tolson, his, you know, companion with whom he had lunch every day, and the whole, you know, Republican values were very, family values were a very big part of the Republican campaign in that period. So, okay, that social movements of the 1960s, obviously a clear place where we can talk about the ways that there's overlap between all these movements. Social movement, the civil rights movement, in terms of tactics, in terms of personnel, in terms of, you know, ideas and you know, development of concepts that would, you know, move forward. So from the 1950s, with the origins of the homophile movement, into the 1960s through Stonewall and into the gay liberation movement, that's a very, very easy place to do this integration. We also have chapters in the book that talk about the whole AIDS movement, anti-AIDS movement, the fight against government inaction, protests, the ways it mobilized people in different kinds of ways. This is also a place to, you know, really to talk about the ways that an issue, which was not just a LGBT issue, but you know, really affected American society in general. We also have a chapter in the book about same-sex marriage, obviously a wonderful, and so there's a whole history that to these kinds of current events, and that's, you know, for any social studies classes that kind of get into current events, there's a history there to talk about, not just, didn't start in, you know, the 2000s. And so I'll just end with some sort of general observations. These are all just really examples of ways that I think that LGBT history is in fact US history, and how it can connect to a whole series of other kinds of things. And one of the teachers in the book, Robert King, talks about, it has really resonated with me in terms of my own experience. A student in his class in Southern California, he was doing was just one lecture of one day. We were talking about the social movements of the 60s and talked about Stonewall, talked about the gay lesbian movement. And his student, Jack Davis, raised his hand and said, I've been waiting for this moment, and I want to say, you know, that I'm gay. And all the students in the class applauded, and they got up and they hugged him. And later he wrote about this incident. He said, that history class may have been the most defining moment of my coming out. He said, walking out, the weight of the world seemingly lifted from my shoulders, and I was ecstatic. And his teacher, Robert King, said it was the highlight of 23 years in the classroom. So this is something for students and for teachers. And I think this applies not just in high school or before, but in college as well. So I'll just end by repeating my refrain. If the mere mention of one event in queer history can make such a difference in a student's life, just imagine what a whole transformed curriculum could really do. So for me, teaching queer history as US history has the potential to enliven history, to make it more complex, to support LGBT students, to educate all students, to help all students understand that sexuality is shaped by the societies in which people live, that just like politics and economics, sexuality is a part of the history of the past. So I end with, this is my campus's signature queer bomb that the students use when they want to make themselves evident. Thank you.
very much. So we have time for questions, and Leila, I'll kind of let you kind of guide it.
Absolutely.
So feel free. Comments, ideas, suggestions, questions?
My name is Gretchen, and I'm a women's studies minor, a women, gender, and sexuality studies minor. And there are a lot of classes in women's studies, but there aren't a lot in gender and sexuality studies. And we're trying to advocate for more classes. Do you have any advice on how to do that or how to make that possible?
You know, I think the best way to do that is to talk to faculty members who are really open to that. And, you know, there are a lot of people who wouldn't mind teaching. John's been talking to people about this because I know the history department had a class this year.
Yeah, I took that class as well.
Okay, and, you know, I think you have to start there. You have to, you know, find out who are the people who do research in this area, because anybody who does research in this area is going to love the idea of getting to teach a class like this. And the other thing is, you know, you can take a lot of sort of generic classes and, you know, shape them this way, or integrate part of them this way. So, like, for example, a class on the history of social movements. You could have a class that would deal a whole lot with, you know, the history of the gay lesbian movement. So, you know, I think you have to really start with, I think, individual faculty members, individual department chairs who are open to that kind of thing, and, you know, kind of go from there. Because most, you know, faculty who work in these kinds of areas just love the opportunity to teach, and you know, especially if there are kind of topics classes in departments where you can, you know, it's already a number. You can teach, you know, whatever you want. That's a great opportunity. Or for, you know, freshman seminars, you're saying, right? So.
FYE, yeah.
So, you know, it seems like you got to use the structure. So, you know, talk to people who know about the structure and how things, you know, get developed, and, you know, go from there. Because you know, there's a lot. We have a lot of classes on the campus, and it really started from students, from student pressure, student activism. There has to be people who want these classes to really go there. So, good luck. Yeah.
When you mentioned the ouch factor, do they just stop talking about what they're discussing, or do they table it for later? Or?
Apparently, what the idea is that that the person who said ouch and the person who said the comment don't have to say anything, but the rest of the class analyzes what was going on. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of ways you could do this. I mean, I think having a conversation right then is probably really helpful. One of the students in John's classes this morning was saying that in his school, they had a thing called the ouch oops rule, where, and I guess they didn't discuss it, so the person would say ouch, somebody else would say oops, which was sort of meant to be I'm sorry, and that was it. But he was saying that got really misused as a sort of, you know, kind of joke almost, like he would say ouch about almost anything, and somebody would say oops, and they would go on from there. I mean, I don't think these things are easy, but I really kind of like that idea, because it's always really, you know, it's very hard to know what to do when someone says something that you know is really offensive to someone else, or that just is plain offensive, and you don't want to slap them down so they never say anything again. So I kind of like the idea of something simple where you don't have to say, oh, but I didn't mean, you know, I didn't know, or, you know, I didn't mean it, but, you know, somebody else could say, well, you know, there's a whole history to that word that, you know, isn't, you know, that isn't a good word to use. And one of the things we were talking about this morning is the whole word queer, and how that is offensive to some people. And yet it's also embraced as having, you know, re-accepted it and, you know, made it something positive. But people could have real different feelings about that. So that would be an interesting, I think that'd be an interesting discussion to have. It's like,
I work at a cataloging department at a public library back home, mostly with women. You know, once in a while, I'm talking about a lot of women issues, and I'm trying to work on my computer. Maybe I should say ouch.
yeah, and you know, the ouch rule works for a lot of things, right? I mean, it doesn't have to just be about this, but you could use it in a lot of kinds of ways. And I just think even if it just calls attention to the fact that, you know, there are words that are hurtful to some people, or things that are said that are hurtful to some people. I mean, and obviously people disagree about, you know, somebody might say, oh, well, you know, the reason people are poor is because they just don't work hard. You know, and we know that's a political position in this country, right? So, but you could still say, ouch, then, you know, about something like that.
Just to add on to that, for some of the faculty that consult with me,
up at the LGBT Center, and young students who are thinking about going into education, some of the hesitation, a lot of the hesitation around whether or not we do integrate these concepts into our classrooms is around what do I do when the conversation ends up possibly creating a homophobic environment in my classroom, and then how you manage that homophobic environment in your classroom. I think the oops, ouch rule is a great way to have a standard way of interrupting and providing that platform to examine and talk about something. But what other ways have you seen, or from the faculty perhaps in the book, a way to manage that potential backlash around these concepts? Because you don't want a really great debate and a really great conversation where you're talking about complex issues and people with very different values on both sides becoming a place where either of them walk away feeling not heard. So
I think that's a really good question, a really difficult question. I think that that just the whole question of how you have a civil conversation in a classroom is, it's important from the beginning. And I think one of the things you have to do is you have to emphasize it like over and over again. It's not like you can say it one time. A lot of us have on our syllabi something about we don't want to hear, we want, civil conversation, blah, 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 blah. And, I honestly, I haven't encountered it in a really long time. Because I do think students are getting, just the representation of LGBT issues in the media has changed so much. It's not, it's not that it's always positive or that it's like everything's fine now, but there's much more awareness of these kinds of issues. So, I don't have personal experience at the high school or below level, except what I know from the teachers that I've talked to. But I haven't really heard a lot of that. I've heard concern about, the sort of snickering aspect of talking about sexuality more than I've heard the homophobic stuff. Partly because I think, at least from what I've heard, there are just so many more students who are out, and I think that just makes an enormous difference. This project that I'm working on queer women on campus now, I really started it because I was really interested in what I thought was that some students came out in high school. And as I'm just coding these. I have 125 interviews, and I've just started to code them. And so far, like everybody came out in high school or before, and that is just a sea change. And so, if almost, I really have no idea what it's like in like the South, for example. But if every school or almost every school, at least in some places, have students who are out, then I just think there's, hopefully there's more awareness about it. But the main thing is just, you can't put that on the students themselves, which I think So yeah, that's I think a difficult issue. But I think not letting it go. That one of the things that some of the teachers really do talk about is that how many teachers just let that stuff go, and then the students know it. So they could call each other names, they can harass or bully people, and nobody says anything. So I think just reacting in any kind of way has got to make some difference. And I think having resources on campus is enormously important. At the high school, the Gay-Straight Alliances, an awful lot of the students at my campus started as allies in the Gay-Straight Alliance, which I think is also a common story. Yeah.
I wanted to thank you, and it gets me thinking about how to make these connections in my lit class. I teach American Lit. It covers the same time frame that you discussed. But I also have teenagers in high school, and I was fascinated by what's going on in California, and I realized I had no idea what's going on in Connecticut. And I see support for LGBT students at the club level, sort of faculty advisors, student essays and such. I don't know if you have any insights or anyone else does. I'm wondering if the book embedded is suitable for high school teachers in our area, it's geared to them as well.
Oh, absolutely. Do you want to say that?
Well, one of the things that we've started the conversation in the Connecticut Council for the Social Studies, the new Connecticut Social Studies frameworks talk about an inquiry arc. So that what social studies should be is asking questions and finding evidence and making arguments and the compelling questions that we're trying to kind of encourage high school and actually social studies teachers at all levels to do are big questions about that will allow students to explore, and so we'll create, we hope, some space for all kinds of different questions, including these questions about what did people who had same, what were their lives like, what was their context, what were they trying to do, and to give some examples. And so the process we think of that inquiry, we think will kind of allow that, and the compelling questions that we're asking allow for and encourage teachers to bring in a diverse set of backgrounds. So one of the big compelling questions, U.S. history is suggested to be taught in 5th as a primary subject in 5th, 8th, and in high school. And one big compelling question across those 3 grade levels is, what did it mean to be an American citizen? And another one was, is America a land of opportunity? And for whom and what challenges they face, which is a perfect way to then to create kind of, one of the things we were talking about in the last couple of days is that some way you need, somebody's question about, how does this happen at the institutional level? At some level you kind of need, I'm almost reluctant to say it, you need kind of a top-down, this is the law, this is what has to happen, and then that creates the space for teachers to say, a defense, right, from some people that are going to be attacking it and saying, hey, hang on, we're asking the big questions, this is what we're doing, and that allows teachers to be more creative and to bring up these issues where they wouldn't before. So the frameworks were just passed in February. We're in the process of working with teachers about bringing this through, and these are subjects that we want to have them. We want to give them the resources to do it, and the kind of that sense that it's okay to do this, and I feel pretty confident about what I'm going to be able to do and how I'm going to weave it through, and I think we'll make some progress. I'm excited about it. I hope. I mean, that's what we can do. We can hope.
And if you think about the fact that, California is still talking about, this law was passed in 2011, and we're still talking about changing the frameworks, progress is slow sometimes. And so how much it's actually made any difference so far, I don't really know. But I think, I'm an optimist, and so I think it will in the future. And I think, I hope that other progressive states will kind of jump on this.
It just seems to me it's important for the school culture to be an enlightened progressive one, and I see work being done at the student organization level and anti-bullying forums and things like that, but it is a big leap to make it more intrinsic to the curriculum. It's an important one.
And we want teachers to understand that you can talk about some of the resistance that we're getting, or the fear is, well, how can I talk about this because I can't talk about sex in my classroom? And one of the things that we talk about, one of the authors talks about in the book, and that we talked about, is we talk about heterosexual people all the time without talking about sex. And that's, like, oh my gosh, how can I talk about, pick an example, right? How can I talk about this person who's a heterosexual because, I might talk about who they loved and how they love it. We don't do that. But at the same time, though, we also need to be clear that there are times when someone's sexual identity, however that was in the past, is an important part of us to talk about. That it wasn't just they happen to be just like everybody else. They did everything the way everybody else, and they happened to be that way. But their sexual identity, who they saw themselves, who they loved, became an important part of how they interacted with the world, and understand that change and that concept at the same time. So there are ways to do it, and there are some great examples of how to do it.
And I actually should have said that, because really this does not just apply to history, but really to a lot of fields where you can do that. And one of our essays is by an English professor who talks about using literature to teach these kinds of topics. So. Yeah.
I had a question. Have you ever thought of how this could be extended to teaching about world history, and especially as certain parts of the country, even at high school level, start having more and more foreign exchange programs, just like teaching it as a part of world history?
Yes, that's a good question. And that's one of the things that when I was at Ohio State, I taught world history, and I do very global work. So one of the second introductory chapter of the book that I wrote is about putting the U.S. in a global context. So it really talks about what I try to do is really problematize even this notion of same-sex sexuality, which tries to be as generic as possible, and yet doesn't really capture what's going on in a lot of contexts where what we would see as same-sex interactions are perceived as different gender interactions or different age interactions or whatever. So I think this, and I do that when I teach. I'm not teaching world history now, but when I teach classes that are global, I definitely bring in, because I think that's the way that you can really get people to understand things like societies that have room for more than two genders, where it's harder to sort of, we talk about the Native American two-spirits, but even that is kind of a gender crossing rather than an expansion of genders. Also, sometimes we talk about their gender. So I think it's a really good example where you can bring in all sorts of things that really help to shape the notion that that societies construct sexuality and gender really differently. So I think that's the most, before this book, the most recent book that I'd written was this Global History of Love Between Women, where I start at the beginning of time and go to the present and like all around the world. Obviously, I didn't do original research on this, but it was a synthetic work bringing together stuff, because I think it totally transforms the way we think about our very contemporary present. So when I teach this material, I definitely put, if we're sort of in this contemporary moment here, I try to put it in that whole global context. But I think we have further to go in terms of reaching people who teach. World history is hard to teach to begin with, right? Because there's so much to do, and you have to think about what's your perspective, and then to kind of add this stuff in. But I think it's really essential, because it helps us to see how different cultures really shape things differently. So that's we start with U.S. history and we go from there. Any questions?
I just have a comment.
Yeah, please.
This was wonderful, and thank you so much for all of the work that you've done and everything that's happening in California. And I very much hope to see this become a trend that moves over here. Connecticut likes to steal things from California, so I'm kind of hoping this is one of those things that we see happen here. And this work is incredibly brave. Teachers being able to say gay in classrooms has not been easy for so long, and this, from a student support service perspective, this saves lives. Absolutely. And the mirror and window concept is something that changes students' ability to see value in themselves and to think that they can become a part of society and bring themselves fully to the table and to exist and to let themselves exist. And so just thank you so much. This is so important, and I hope every history class starts talking about LGBT everything as part of our regular way of being. So wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, let's all thank you.